practices with diverging values, interests, and desires co-develop projects and organizations, engaging in emerging systemic crises. In that sense, our mission with Primer and the work we do in Diachron is not to simply bring art into a new context, but what we think of as a general diversification of which practices feed into technology development. Um, so, leading to the question of this panel, the question of audience, size, agents, and aliens, whatever that might mean, for us is related to the core mission of attempting to build out new relationships between specialized fields of practices with the purpose of having effects at a systemic scale. So necessarily a differentiated approach, as Amitai was talking about, entails highly differentiated contributors more so than audiences. And one key segment, of course, of Primer's contributors are the employees of this place, who are biochemists, biologists, plumbers, engineers, business developers, production teams, quality control, as well as students from all those fields. Um, as Peter, the CEO of the company, says when he explains to people the kind of translation problem they're facing, is that we start in plumbing and we have to mediate all the way to nanoscale technology and synthetic biology. And in that sense, art is another kind of translational agent in that space of highly different fields that need to somehow develop entirely new languages in order to be able to speak to each other. So since we entered this space in 2016, one of the main things we have been doing basically is getting to know the people there. So getting to know their worlds, where they come from, their specialization, and their ideas for where they want to be in the future. And all of this, of course, is not something that's articulated, say, through the company's communication, for example. It's something you really need to slowly unfold through long-term relationships and trust. Um, so in that sense, yeah, I wouldn't say we have audiences, but rather contributors who we have slowly educated and who slowly educate us on an ongoing basis, in order for all of us to be able to enter a new field where we can have new conversations about what we want to do together. Yes, and to finish off, I had a quote by Ian Cheng I wanted to read out loud, which sort of came to mind after Lars's presentation. So Ian writes, I wanted to create a world from nothing, to understand the artificiality of making a world, and to become attentive to the magical moment when a world begins to take on a life of its own, despite its artificiality. Worlding is the unnatural art of creating an infinite game by choosing a present, storytelling its past, simulating its futures, and nurturing its changes. Yeah.
Yes, it is good. Thank you. Every day, we calendar our minutes in absurdum, yet we feel constantly behind schedule. Every day, we process a massive overload of information, yet we never feel updated enough. Every day, we connect to the whole world and beyond, yet what we most desire is to be fully right here, right now. Every day, we are reminded that this constant rush is not what we dream of, that something needs to change. Founded by artists in 1998, Signal is a center for contemporary art in Malmö, Sweden. Early on, it organically formed into a group of artists and curators, led by a desire to explore the meaning of collaboration and curation, to support artists, to promote to propose new modes of production, to stimulate the ongoing public discourse around art. Signal is today the sum of the people that have been involved. Christian Andersson, Maria Bussnes, Alexander Gutke, Sara Jordanö, Magnus Tirfelder, Eva-Lena Thulin, Elena Tzotzi, Johan Svensson, Emma Reichert, Carlotta Blöndal, Luca Frey, Rune Lagomarsino, Johan Tirén, Carl Lind, Fredrik Steed, Joel Odebrand, Matthew Rana. Our mode is slow and rugged, infused with humor. Our vision is to push ideas forward in dialogue with tenderness and sensitivity. Our home is our space, with one foot firmly rooted in Malmö and the other outside, maintaining a physical presence that is welcoming and intimate. Stepping into a third decade, we haven't cracked the time riddle. Yet this is what we will be working on this coming time and continue to develop. A tempo and rhythm that allows for a deeper search, determined to walk with time on our side and to cultivate the pleasure of staying with the now in all the aspects of artistic process. Thank you for staying in tune with us. This is the condensed version of our 20 years. In the everyday life, it's been more like this. This is Mike Kelly's Catholic Birdhouse from 1978, with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears involved, as you all can imagine. For this presentation, I could mention several examples of projects where we have departed from the traditional formats of the institutional white cube, which we have and which in a way is also part of this conference. But throughout the years, I've come to the conclusion that these are kind of structural questions. I'm not saying that they're not important, but they evolve around structure choices. The most radical act today, I would say, and is also something that we together running Signal have come to understand, is a loving and caring approach towards others and towards what you do. So we live in a hard art world. There is too much toxicity, insecurity, and big egos that have set the standard on how to behave and treat each other. So for me and us as Signal, the radical act is not to play by those rules, not to copy this behavior, to make sure other ways are possible and successful. Again, in the sense of asking what success means, but really showing that. So, with the risk of sounding like a complete love guru standing here, I would say that we have challenged the prevailing norms of the institutional white cube through love and not structure. And when I use the word love, it's something that is not, something taken easily and mellow as a way of just, easygoing, whatever is okay. No, totally the opposite. It's about being very clear about what is important and what you don't want to do. Which of course also puts you in a position that you're not this kind of player in the art world. You often put your foot totally wrong, but that raises also discussion and a debate and questions. It's also about being very precise about how you use your voice and how you use your resources. And with resources, I don't really mean excess of money, but I mean the resources of what we're saying and doing and acting. Of course, going back also to the question of the who and for whom, size and time is very important. Like the size of the space, the institution, the collaboration It's very much about this intimacy of being there in all aspects, like being both from the director to the cleaning lady, to the bar woman, to the one greeting the audience, to the one forming the curatorial questions, working them through with the artists we invite, and then being able to have interesting conversations with our audience. And it's about spending that time, which is a lot of time, but it's about not doing 100 things at once. It's just like doing that and doing it well. I would also like to use another expression that I've learned from Anthony Huberman, um, to wear your heart on your sleeve. It's an expression that at the time totally resonated with me. But with time, I've also understood that to do that, you need also to wear your brain on your sleeve and your strength on your sleeve. Because it's a position that you really need to kind of, you need to keep guard of. People might see that as a way of being soft, but it's not. It's about being super strong. And again, very, very determined um, on how you want to operate and why you want to operate. And to use all the assets that you have in your imagination, but also in the actual acting, to find all those loopholes that do exist there in order to create an alternative that you are talking about, alternative ways. And I also think it's important, it's not about one alternative, but it's really about being very specific to your context and reacting to it and discussing with it and possibly actually changing it. Thank you.
So I should remind you all to write down now questions on the little notes we've made. And they will be collected in a second. And also just a note on the notes. They are collected, and then if they're not being called out loud from my end, they're going to end up, or on one of the other moderators, they're going to end up on these different little boards that we put up over there, so you can see them over time growing. And then I think we could maybe use that as something we return to for our workshop tomorrow. But while you write down little notes, I will set us off with a few questions. And I thought about asking you like 3 different questions that has to do with bandwidth. Because in a way, bandwidth can be understood in 3 different ways. It can be either bandwidth as transmission, but it can also be frequency, difference in frequency. And it can be capacity, exhaustion, like the bandwidth you have to do something. So I'm going to address those 3 things, ask you questions, and then we can take it from there. Bandwidth as transmission, transmission is capacity of a computer network or a telecommunication system and how much data would be transferred per second. In this case, it could be transferred into the transfers of meeting someone, what's the audience reach. We could also talk about the transmission within, I think Prem asked a very pertinent question earlier on, a cultural landscape. So I would like to ask each of you to think a little more about how much is being transferred and within which cultural landscape. And I thought of that for you, Kala. I thought of that with this like idea of, there's a really interesting idea of like rejection of transmission, of distribution, which of course could be read at some sort as exclusivity. At the same time, new theater is placed in the possibly largest cultural landscape of Europe, Berlin. So that would be interesting to hear you think a little bit about. For Signal, I think there's a completely different play going on. You're in Malmö, you're in your third decade, not 2 years, but now plus 20. What does that mean in terms of a both cultural landscape and transmission function, how much is transferred at this stage, and has that maybe also changed over time? Because as you said, time is an important factor. And then for you, David, and Amitai, I guess there's a question of this idea of effect at a systemic scale, which I find like fabulous. Like that's really pregnant and wonderful and big. Organizational dissatisfaction and maybe sort of ideas of different organizations, very interesting. But then at the same time, a 70-person employee, operation and a corporate place, which is outside of Copenhagen, away from the inner city. So that maybe also again comes back to some ideas of exclusivity and inclusivity and who's included in that conversation. Okay, so maybe you want to start?
No, big questions. Thank you guys. Also wonderful. I think for us, the question was, is a space enough? Like that's the thing is we were like, we don't want it to, I mean, a video of a play is horrible. It just is. It's like not fun to watch. My dad doesn't even want to see them. So like, I think we knew our medium didn't transfer that well, but at the same time, I really believe that I just wanted people to come to this space, and that's kind of how you were supposed to experience it. But I think by the end, we were challenged by this thing about it being exclusive and it's like when you can only seat 60 people, it sells out really fast, and then you're an asshole when you're like, no. So we started adding more things, but this is also why I think it's important to end things, and it's important to kind of learn through the experience of a space. And I think we were able to understand kind of how much language you could generate in one space, kind of with as much energy and transmission as possible for the people who could get there. And I think this next challenge for us is to think about how you can build in some sort of broadcast or satellite that can allow it to be, I think inclusive is also hard because like, what do people want from watching it? And so these are, or what do people want by joining in, or do like, I think there is this really amazing thing about performance in theaters. When you're in the audience, you're forced to deal with it in a really special way, not in a kind of like Netflix and chill, do whatever you want. Like, so what we're challenged about, and I don't think we'll release anything for a year in the new space, because we want to think about how you can build a sort of system for transferring to a wider space that has like the intensity of performance still built into it, which I don't know how to do, but yeah, that's what we're grappling with next. So we'll see.
Yeah, I think it's really super interesting. Also, one thing it makes me think of is in terms of something we've been talking quite a lot about is also the kinds of effects that you're able to somehow trace or to think about. I thought about it a lot in terms of the bar, all these kind of as the resolution of like what are you even capable to think of is something that is quite relevant in the thing we're doing, because we try to think about it in the processual sense. Okay, but I'm jumbling a little bit, but there's all these like there's the proteins, there's the scales that are invisible to see, there's the layer of kind of meeting the people, there's the organizational level. There's a lot of the
And maybe I can add that I think, I mean, the site of Aquaporn is not only in Kongens Lyngby, and it's not the only site that we are relating to, but it's of course a really important part of our project. When we entered in 16, there were 45 employees, and they didn't have a hub in the US. So we are also emerging with a living entity that is developing alongside us. Of course, effects at a systemic scale sounds grandiose, but I still think it's super interesting to think through how might you have a stake in affecting a company that is right now the only company in the world working with this protein. and trying to figure out its use in the world. And that's something we actually have totally direct access to on a daily basis. So there are many decisions to be made in terms of how do you then negotiate that kind of relationship.
But I wonder, because when I talked about when I hear you talk about effects as a systemic scale, I hear two things. I hear on the one hand using primer very specifically within aquaporin to create a dialogue that is in a way in the tradition of, say, artist placement group. So there's of course a backdrop to what you're doing, and I wonder. I don't know if I don't know. I don't have the comments on whether that is like today a successful model, but it would be interesting to hear you think a little bit about how you think, primer can be, why you think it can have systemic scale, impact. Why do you think it's more relevant now than in the 60s? Is it?
I don't know if it's more. I mean, it's probably also important in the 60s, but I mean, the fact that we are facing several border-crossing planetary scale crises, which are incredibly hard to name, see, engage, work with in a meaningful manner, but which all of us probably have a sense that we will be dealing with in an increasing manner within the next whatever how many years, which I feel like is different to say 5 or 10 years ago, where these things were like slowly simmering, and now they seem to take on a more kind of solid form.
Then I had to just hold you for a second. The other question would be, you're set within the cultural landscape of, say, Denmark, Scandinavia. It's super untraditional, I think, in this context to do something with a company, something that goes deep into corporate, private, anyway, the corporations. Maybe say a little bit about that as your cultural landscape.
You mean how I see the cultural landscape sees us doing that?
Yeah,
or?
yeah. Well, if you think that is, especially important is that especially important in Scandinavia? Is it a model we haven't? Is it something you see happening elsewhere and not here? And yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I mean, sure. There's several historical precedents: Artist Placement Group, Xerox Park, experiments in art and technology, all that stuff. But I think contemporarily, you're probably looking more at consultancies, design research studios, and basically actors who are trying to, diversify who participates in the development of technology and why, and how those processes put together. So I think we are in a space akin to that. We are just a different set of people with a different set of values and ideas, and are trying to enter into that conversation from more from an artistic background than a consultancy background or a design background.
Can I just add to that question? I would say actually the opposite. I think that in Scandinavia, especially in Sweden, there's always been this wish to find, the purpose of art. So having artists go into corporations or technology or engineering has been like the wet dream of which I think is very problematic, because then you don't really see the other values of what artistic practice means. So I would say that I think that there is a tradition, and a tradition that is not necessarily is not just good or bad, but it's also kind of takes or gives gives raison d'être, which I don't think is the main purpose. Yeah, so that was just a reflection. And then bandwidth for 20 years. Yes, I mean I would say it's maybe a kind of process of maturing very much. I mean, when we opened up, I remember people thinking that we were very arrogant, which you might not think and today we are more seen like this institution that people take for granted, although we are as in a as sensitive and precarious situation. So I'm not so concerned about the idea of the bandwidth as such, but more about creating the space and tone that allows us, together with the people we work with, our audience, to have good discussions and to share thinking, knowledge, but also to change values, to change, how you want to be as a human being and how you want to treat others. And yes, we do operate in a small bubble, but still, I think it's very much a way of being.
Okay. Second question, bandwidth as difference of frequency and complexity within a frequency, or variety of frequencies. So that kind of brings on a question which is about how much the experiment or the project or the institution allows in terms of complexity, variety, and expression. And in a way that comes back to this idea, I think, of agents and aliens, and if there were cross pollinations between the two and how they then happened. And you talked, of course, some about that already, Kala, but maybe start the other way around. Maybe you can start by talking about that.
In a
Elena.
very pragmatic example, I mean, we have been talking about names and fantasy names, and our name has always been Signal, but it was actually the audience that asked, I mean, the audience not within the art world, but people, well, what is Signal? Why should I go into something that has the sign Signal? Can you not explain what you are? And then constal signals sounded totally stupid. So Center for Contemporary Art just became the explanation, but out of, a wish for people to know what they were going to. A very pragmatic example, but otherwise, I think it's always this kind of constant discussion and bouncing ideas, and then some of them kind of filter into the program, but it's not really that we invite necessarily the audience to be part of performing in that way, but they're always, they're in that kind of extended family of thinking with us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when talking about this network we have set up, we do spend quite a lot of time identifying who else globally work in the manner that we are trying to do, and simply talk to them and contact them and have a discussion. So, yeah, I guess our project is sort of traversed by really specific, purposeful relationships that we establish because they have a function. And then, of course, besides that, you have a bunch of you have all the kind of audiences you never knew you had, but you figure out because they contact you and want something or have an interest. So that's kind of an added layer to that. But I think we mainly work quite, strategically actually, in terms of really spending time on surveying who are doing similar things and should we be in contact with them.
I think for us, like starting, and we like doing things we don't really know how to do completely because it keeps us open to bringing in things and other people, and people can kind of come forward and be like, nah, it should be like that. And we're like, oh, great. Why don't you come do that? Or so I think for us, theater was this kind of tool that we learned collectively. And I think that allowed it to kind of like snowball and pick things up. And so I don't know, I think to allow people in, you kind of have to like really kind of de-skill yourself or like just you have to believe that everyone's just kind of on the same level and we're going to figure it out together. And I think New Theater was, I think, successful in that, but not perfect, and it's like I know some people felt alienated by certain things, and that's, I think, also just the way it is when you run a space and there's a certain amount of exhaustion with like you can only do so much and you can only be around for so long. But yeah, I think for us it's always been about kind of leveling ourselves, being like, okay, we figured that out, let's like cut ourselves back down. So yeah.
Okay, but that in a nice way leads to, I think, capacity, bandwidth as capacity, and maybe also exhaustion, and in a way how much mental capacity you have or did have within your institutional work, and in that sense, whether there's things you would wish to have more of to be better in handling, or or to better how you handle things to extend. And I'm really also thinking at this point about, of course, in some silly things like economy, very important, and what's the limits of your capacity, and when does the kind of gasoline run out? And in this, I just thought that there was a nice. So maybe you could start again, Elena, because in a way I thought there's something so beautiful about you. I think actually within this setting, Signal is the longest existing
The dinosaur.
that's longest existing space, which is of course wonderful. And the hard road is being employed, and there's a lot of ideas of love. But I wonder, like, whether there could also be something that's like an unrequited love there. Um, then I thought about you, Kala, maybe talking a little bit more about this. About you talked about failed alternative economies and how that was a subject in the plays, but maybe also how that in a way was a backdrop of the space. And the interesting thing here to me especially is that after that being, the kind of backdrop of new theater and maybe also Times Bar, of course, many of these artists have turned super successful. And if we look again at some historic precedents of artists grouping together, doing collective work, no authorship, often that ends up in the kind of commitments problem, everyone wanting to be the lead singer, and who takes the authorship and what happens then. Anyway, exhaustion, economy, question there. And with you, at the being still at the beginning of things, it's maybe more of an explorative question, and but also maybe a question that pertains to your investment into a private company that exhausting you, giving potentially enormous resources to another company. So yeah.
So I start.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've really done the full circle of total exhaustion, constantly asking the question why, now it's enough. We've also moved many times, been kicked out of our space, which of course also then just, you're really forced to ask, where do I have the energy to continue? But with all that, there is something really, now I'm sounding like, but very unique and beautiful in that taking matters in your own hands, and really be the one that, yes, you do all the work, but it's also you at the end of the day who make all the decisions. And for me, that's really, yeah, I mean, that's the only way I can function. So I know that the price is exhaustion, but I love it. I mean, really. And I have tried working within institutions, and there have been very good lessons of what I don't want to do. So again, I think it's really about mm, being clear with yourself what you want to do, and then find joy in that and pleasure. And then, of course, I also think that the better you get at it, the more you can also feel confident in um, finding other tempos and other temporalities. Because yes, in the beginning, we also thought that we had to do 10 shows a year and blah, 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 blah. But then at the end, you say, well, it's not really about the numbers, because, what format are you copying? So I think it's also about that time, perseverance, strength, and the self-confidence to make your own set of programming rules, timing, tempos, and yeah, and stick with that somehow and have fun with it.
One thing. Hello. um, just one thing I thought about it also in terms of the question of alienation is the possibility for a kind of in a positive sense that which is something I would really love to see also my own practice as an artist becoming alienated into a different kind of working together with yeah, just the basic premise of the possibility for linking into other processes that take that work into something a completely different direction. Um, and it's linked somehow to the question of economy and the term, like generally speaking, the way that so many artists are kind of like struggling to work with what they would like to do. Um, so I think that's also that's one impetus for exploring a kind of setting like this and a kind of collaboration like this, in the most basic terms. Yeah. But there are several others.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, the more kind of concrete economic fun stuff is basically that. I mean, when you're trying to develop a new model, you need to consider the financial aspect of that as a new thing also. So it's something we are discussing with uh, the company, which is basically Peter, who's the CEO of the company, who invited us in, which is basically the question of how can you fund the kind of work we do. We wouldn't have been able to answer that question day one because we didn't know what work we would end up doing. So we needed to build the model before we could figure out how to fund it. So I guess, of course, there is a lot of precedents for these kinds of collaboration in a Danish context, but they're mainly focused on collection-based collaborations where big companies are basically buying and have huge art collections. But we are focusing more on funding human resources. So the company actively co-funds PhD and postdoc positions in our project. And then this newest edition of what's called public-private partnerships, which is basically a generic term for any public-private actor working together on a shared mission. The EU 2020 Horizon projects being one example, or Aquaporin does a lot of work in Singapore, which is the one country in the world that reuses most of their water, 87%, if you're interested. And basically, Peter, who's the CEO, said that when you develop such a project, that funds the entire company. So HR, finance, X, Y, and Z. So why not fund the artistic production through that also? And of course, in that context, we are not doing a big exhibition maybe, but then we have to figure out what is the kind of new type of practice that can develop in that space. So yeah, it's very much something that we are sort of developing on an ongoing basis, and it just takes time, basically.
I'm trying to remember back to your question. The setting of the fragile economic realities that we were often lampooning, which were our own. I think for us, when you have actors, you have to pay them. And it was this thing that we never had enough money to pay people for their time. So one of the ways we figured out how to move forward is we would kind of commit to doing a piece with people who worked with us. So like someone who had give us a lot of time in one piece, we would then put on a piece of theirs. So then Max and I would kind of step in as producers. So it really was this like extreme workhorse by the end to kind of fulfill all of the like production debt we accrued through and like a lot of white wine. I think that's also how we paid people, and that's why the bar was just like a mess. But so yeah, we were very, and I mean, we funded it through we never got money for it. So it was just like funded in the most bizarre ways. Like the space came with an old storage that we turned into an apartment that we rented out. And like, it was just insane. And like every time we'd sell a piece, we'd put the money in, or like sometimes the bar would work. Sometimes we'd sell enough tickets. It was like a mess. So we definitely like the exhaustion level, we like couldn't afford to continue, I think, in that way. And it was definitely young and dumb. And, but in that way, it's like I don't think we could ever do it again like that. And I guess that's the other side of your question was a lot of people came out of it with a lot of strength, I think, which was really exciting for us. And I think that, I mean, I don't like doing anything unless I can do it like 150%. And we were so in it with every single person there that I think most people like were able to juice what they wanted out of us by the end. I think we still have some debts to repay, and we are slowly but surely. But yeah, I think it's just about being really present with the people you're working with when the economics are fragile, and like making sure that everyone feels safe and seen and cared for, especially when you're putting on stage to basically make fun of them. So, you know, it's like that was really like it was a hot moment, and I think we all came out okay. I don't think anyone came out the lead singer. I think Max and I had to put in so much, like, we're just scrubbing the toilets as everyone's talking about. It's like when you put that much energy in, I think people kind of see and understand that you're not capitalizing on it in a way where it's like a golden box that you're standing on. But there was still tons of drama, as there always is with these things, as there should be with a theater. But yeah, so I don't know. That's
Great. I think I'll open up for questions from the audience. Anyone's got a question they want to raise now, or else I'm going to dive into this pool of written ones. Okay, then I'm going to go to a question that goes to... No, it's ignoring you, Chris. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your talks and the discussion in general. I have a quick question for Amitai and David, right? You're both artists, right? I'm curious to know, like, how different your artistic practice is from the practice of running this space. And I'm also wondering what makes it a space or an institution as opposed to an artistic project? Like, why isn't this your, I mean, could it be your practice? And if not, why isn't it your practice?
It is your practice.
Well, I mean, when people ask me the question, "What is your practice? What do you do?" when I'm out like biking with strangers who have no fucking clue what art is, then I always say like I build or try to build new cultural institutions. So that's the kind of top level, whatever generic answer. But then of course you have to get into the specifics of what are you then doing or what are you building, and you probably won't find one satisfactory name that will continually fit what you're doing. So you have to, I mean, we spend a lot of time doing stuff like this where you're like talking and trying to find the right words, and then going through that process of language creation basically. So I don't think we have one perfect way of explaining what we're doing, but it's something we're working on an ongoing basis, also differentiated towards the different actors we're talking to. So when I'm talking to you, I need to use specific language. When I'm talking to a biochemist, I need to talk in a different manner.
So in the end, for you, it's like one and the same thing. There's kind of no distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I have the most boring answer to that question, which is basically that I'm trained as an artist, and it flows into what I do in ways I can't. How do you say it? Like I have no idea over or control over, but it's sort of something that, is present in whatever I do. And following on from this argument of diversification, I think it's really important that we consider that artists are actually incredibly skilled and incredibly knowledgeable, but the ways in which we operationalize that in our societies is not corresponding to the kind of the enormous amount of value found in all of these people who work in ways that are difficult to understand. And I think we need to use way more energy creating specific language for what each of us are capable of. Yeah.
I guess it's just a question of like efficacy. Like, is it more effective or more meaningful, I guess, if you say it's a space or an institution, or if it's an artistic practice? Like, for me, I wonder if it doesn't have more meaning to say it's an artistic practice. But I guess it also, for you, it's something that's much more fluid and depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah, just that I mean, I have my interest going into it. Amitai has other interests. Aslak, who's an action researcher, has a set of totally different other interests going into it. And then there's the top level description of what the project is. And all of those different elements needs to be, they're under constant renegotiation, I guess. So I guess, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done in that space.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Thanks. I guess this panel is making me wonder about professionalization and deprofessionalizing, or training as an artist, or qualifying, and the way that often static institutions have working cultures very similar to other parts of society. And thinking, I guess, in the ways that you're working, what you think about this, like what qualities of professionalism and these questions like matter to you, or like what are you trying to unlearn, or yeah.
I can start with a 20-year experience and say that, well, for us, it was very important from the beginning not to copy an existing structure, but not really knowing what that meant. So, of course, we did go through phases where we did copy, this kind of different people had different specialities and they would kind of do that all the time. But throughout the years, a very important question to us was, how do we organize our time? So how do we organize our work? How do we understand work? There was also a moment when, I don't know why, but we had this false idea that, you really need to show that you work. So we would be like from 9 to 5. Totally stupid, yes, but it's like we really had to try that out to also kind of reject it. But I will also say that we don't really have a manual for that, because it all depends on who is involved. So it's also very much trying to find a personal relationship within the organization that would then function at the time. So it's something that, again, is very kind of ephemeral, is fragile, but is also strong, because it also allows us to find our ways, and also to put all the effort on what is important, not administration, not bureaucracy. Of course, we need to deal with that, but that shouldn't be the task that takes up most of the time. So yeah, really kind of constantly navigating and not forgetting to ask that question: what is work, and what do we do with our time?
I think we take it really, really seriously, like the absurdism of it. Like that, I think, is kind of like, even as like we really don't know what we're doing, we're going to take it like as seriously as possible. And I think that allows also people to join in because they realize we're not joking. And it's like, we're going to do this and we're going to do it in 2 weeks. And this is how we're going to do it. And we'll figure it out. So I think within the unlearning, you kind of have to have a heightened, and it is this thing where I think artists do have all these skills, and it's amazing the second you're like, okay, we have to like make a like scene in a like science fiction. It's like things can happen so quickly and in such bizarre ways. But I think there just has to be this type of commitment that this is as serious as anything else. So for us, it was always kind of maintaining this balance, and it goes back to just being like hyper present and there. Like you can't give the keys to the whip and walk away and hope it's okay. It's this sort of like intensity that I think allows for things in a de-skilled environment to work or grow quickly.
Yeah, I don't know about the professionalism thing, but to me personally, I find it super interesting being in a context and being so close to something you in the abstract would call technology development or something, but on a daily basis for us has been being really close to a company that is merging and actually doing that, and what does it look like, and where are the kind of where are the easy things and where are the kind of blockages to what they're doing. So that's super interesting, and then seeing also how does that whole world vice versa change what art is, or what kind of challenges art and the way in which we see and operate in the world. From the most banal things of like when we enter space and we see something on the wall and there's like a placard next to it, we immediately identify it and all our cognitive schemas like fire up. And these employees do not have that, and they see nothing we do in that way. So it's a totally blank slate in terms of building up a new kind of set of cognitive schemas and common language. So it really is sort of it makes for a situation where you can't simply rely on inherited cultural rituals or something, but you have to sort of build them up anew and invent new ways of doing things, and then constantly consider what you want to repeat from the set of tools you have from our art background. So it's super interesting in that regard, and then also just seeing, because it's such a technology laden space, that all art is also in some sense a history of technology in a way, because all art was produced using a specific technology, which it does in a transformative manner. And I think the sort of influences across, say, art and technology are incredibly complex and probably transport in ways that are really hard to account for. So that's something that sort of seeps to the top in that space. You really look at what is the material, and the engineers are like, they want to touch things, and they want to talk about how technical people are also poets, and all those kinds of things. So all of that comes from this kind of collapse of two worlds, which you may think are distinct, but when you actually sort of mash them together, you see kind of new similarities kind of emerging from that meeting in ways that are super interesting and really specific to the people in that space. Yeah.
So I'm going to just take one question here that came in writing, which is related to the question of, I guess, professionalism, unlearning, and maybe also this kind of hovering question above us all, which is, how does one measure success? Well, so the question is, failure has become somewhat of a neoliberal buzzword, a romanticized notion of open-ended processes. But you have mentioned being open to wrong ways, to the wrong foot being put forth, letting things be what they are. How much is that a conscious strategy? How do you sit with a revisit failures? Question mark.
Yeah, we like to make fun of ourselves. I mean, it's like, that's really, yeah, I think it's like, we really process, like, we like to sit around and be like, okay, well, that was like horrible. Like, we really, like, how do we, and then we kind of like, that becomes like a building block in a way. But that, I think, is also this sort of like therapeutic, cathartic theater thing that I don't think I really understood before we got involved with this space, that you like sit in a circle and talk about your like fears and anxieties, and that can end up turning into something that, like, I think, I mean, that, like, this neoliberal failure thing is really stressful. I do, like, and I find a lot of my language, like, I'm triggered within that. But I do think within this kind of like other thing, this like more therapeutic sense, it becomes this sort of building block. But I think that's also like what kind of performing is, this sort of like taking your fear and turning it into power. Yeah, I don't know if that answers that.
I would say we never do failure. I mean, putting your foot in the wrong, it's not something that we plan, and it's not something that we kind of consciously, it's just, you react to things, and then they just kind of get back to you. And I would say that it's not so much in the terms of the artistic process, but it's much more in the kind of the, navigating the art world. How to be kind of the smooth operator, which we are not in a way. So I guess maybe that would then be, but I also agree that failure is as problematic as alternative and independent. So again, it's about being very precise. When you use that word, how do you use it? Why do you use it? And then really kind of really use it. So if it's really about testing something out and also really wanting to kind of touch upon failure, fine. Otherwise, it's experience. You gather experiences, and not everything goes exactly as planned, but that's also the part of the work.
At one point, we had this thing of publishing all the like applications and like all the stuff that didn't become into anything. but it's a little bit. I don't think we've done it for some time, so there can be like a full package that can be disclosed. I don't know. I think I haven't actually doing this, but I don't know why exactly. But working in this thing, yeah, basically also the impetus for working together is also a kind of a way to build a sort of a strength in a kind of a homeostatic situation, like a basis gruppe, even though it looks like very far from that. So I don't know, but there's something about working in a setting that looks extremely professional, but it's a kind of a deprofessionalizing of yourself, or openness to some very other ways, possibilities that makes you think a little bit less about failure, which is quite nice. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, we have a few minutes left to wrap up, and I thought a good place to wrap up would be with the two last questions that both deal with language. And in that sense, we will sort of end where tomorrow starts. So, for primer and new theater, the language of both primer and new theater are very specific. Primer using organizational, business-like language, new theater speaking literary, hip, non-institutional language. How do these modes affect your institution's reception within the so-called art world or the art context? So that's the one question.
Oh, you're making me go first? Okay. No, I never know how people think about, it's hard to know what other people think about you. I think that's a horrifying way to look at things. But I think there's there's a humor to what new theater is, and it's different from my practice outside of the art. And so when we go into that, it's I don't care. I mean, it's fun. We're on stage. It's funny. There's this sort of kind of looseness to it that I really find relieving, and that for me is kind of an escape from, I think, what I would call a kind of toxic art world that we're in right now. And I think a lot of people came to new theater feeling like they were able to escape that sort of toxicity of working in a gallery space and having to have the same conversations over and over again. And so I don't know if that answers it, but I think it kind of it's a rejection or something of wanting to deal with kind of what other people thought of it. I don't know. And people hate theater. That's this other thing. And that's what's so fun is people at the end of the plays would be I fucking hated that. And we'd be thank you for saying it. You never say that after an exhibition. You never walk up to an artist and you're I hated your fucking painting. But people would say it to our face, because theater is really and I think there's just a strange relationship to it. So it's I found that so liberating, especially because at this period in Berlin, it's everything was it was getting really I mean, and you were there during this period. It's it was really getting boxed up. So there was this huge relief of not caring that it's we were doing this extremely embarrassing stuff every night. So yeah, I think that's where we found our lack of mirror.
This buzz.
Business-like. I don't know, often people have this question of, oh, you're mimicking, or you're talking someone else's language, and I'm no, I'm just venturing into this land, and there are other languages, and I co-opt them and use them for my purposes, and in a quite earnest way. Actually, I have no I have no intention of making fun of this context or anything, but actually, in order to learn how a different world works, you need to really engulf yourself in the concepts and languages, and then suddenly it comes out of your own mouth in this setting, and then people are "What the fuck are you saying?" So there's often a lot of explanation to be done in terms of where is your critical stance, for example, or Marx question mark, stuff like that, which are totally valid questions, but there's it just takes so much time going through the specifics of a collaboration like this, where you really need to consider the specific economic flows and stuff like that. Yeah.
Okay, then as the finale to you, Elena, Someone writing, I found the talk fascinating, but also very abstract. Can you say more about how a position of love manifests itself in
Yes,
Signal's
yes,
institutional
totally,
approach
totally.
and methodology? And then it ends up by asking how it is different from other forms of institutional action, I think it is, yeah, of other forms of institutional action.
It's really about giving everything you have all the time, and treating, I mean, really with the artists that we invite and work with, to always make the best possible with what we have, but not just in resources, also in, really pushing, having a very close dialogue in what is being formed, and also being able to I mean, really push so that you feel that it is a joint risk that you take, but it's also a joint work. So the risk is not just on the shoulder of the artist. We're committed to that, and then also making sure that the best possible working conditions, like for example being able to have a production budget to get an artist fee. And again, I'm not speaking about huge sums, but with what we have to really make the best conditions. And then once the exhibition is on, it's really about treating your audience in the most welcoming and caring way, and engaging with the audience. And with that, I'm not saying hunting them down and telling them what they should see, but really to take the time to meet them, so that they also feel welcome and invest their own time in our work. I mean, without our audience, we're nothing. So, yeah, I would also extend that practice of love, which, to also figuring out ways to work with the system that exists. And now, of course, I'm speaking from the position of Sweden. There is still cultural politics, but it's also something that we really need to be very, very careful with and fight for. So it's also working with that set of questions in your practice. Yes, maybe this is again quite abstract, but it's like it's more it's really acting and not just talking, if that kind of makes sense. But always with the respect, with the mutual respect. As much as I respect my own time and work, I want to respect all the others that are involved in that joint project somehow.
Well, I think it's a beautiful note to end on: institutional bandwidth, investment, and love. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and thank you all. Thank you so much for the lovely presentations and the discussion. So we start again tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. in this space. Be precise, because we are going to start at 10 a.m. Okay? Good.